it against me. Excellent. Okay. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us here today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend my respect and solidarity to any First Nations people in the room. This terror was not nullius. Sovereignty was not ceded. This land was not without a people. This land is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. And I think off the back of NAIDOC Week, such an important week in our calendar to honor and celebrate and share stories, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity this afternoon with our special guest Orly to be able to do just that, to share stories with you all. So a little bit of housekeeping. For the bathrooms, we do have a couple just outside the door over there. Your emergency exits in case of, I don't know, Godzilla, Pauline, you know the drill. That's where you've got to go, just over there to the door. And phones, if I can have your phones on silent, that would be greatly appreciated. Obviously, if you want to tweet furiously about this event, good tweets only. Tag us, tag AJDS Tweets and APAN, the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network. You're more than welcome to. So, without further ado, and before I hand over to Orly, just to tell you very quickly what we're planning on doing. So Orly will have the mic for about 15 minutes, and she'll talk sort of a free flow, a little bit about herself and what she does. Presumably everyone's Google stalked her already, so we'll be able to have a bit more of a, an in-depth conversation, hopefully this afternoon. Once Orly's done, her and I will chat a little bit. I'll be asking her questions. And then after that, we'll open the floor over to you guys for some questions from the audience as well. So definitely keep that in mind if you have anything pressing or urgent that you want to tag it, field at us. Born in Iran, Orly Noy engages with Israeli politics and culture through her identity as a Mizrahi woman. Mizrahi meaning Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. Orly is a journalist at +972 and Local Call, an activist with the Belet political party, and a translator of Farsi poetry to Hebrew. Orly has been brought to Australia by the Australian Jewish Democratic Society, a progressive Jewish community organisation based in Melbourne that has been active since the early 80s, advocating for justice in Israel and Palestine, as well as broader social justice issues. They have a stall, so feel free to go up and have a chat to them after the talk, but we are very grateful for them for bringing Orly this afternoon and for this trip, for us to be able to hear a very critical perspective on what's happening on the ground and where to next. So without further ado, please, if you can put your hands together for Orly Noy.
Thank you so much, Sarah, also for, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation with you. And thank you everyone for coming. This is actually my last event in the store in Australia. And throughout the events that I participated in so far, I had to, it was a tremendous opportunity for me to be acquainted with a whole different set of terminology and points of reference that are very obviously critical to you here. The notions of what it means to be indigenous to a land, what it means to be a settler, a colonializer in it, and is there a way out of this place, and if so, how? And of course, a lot of these questions, and it was really, all these events were extremely thought-provocative for me, and they relate, of course, very closely to my own experience as a Mizrahi political activist, a Jewish Mizrahi political activist in a National Palestinian Party in Palestine, Israel. And I maybe want to start, I think there is a point where many of these lines of thoughts meet. Exactly this week, a year ago, the Israeli Knesset passed the nation-state law, which I assume that you heard of very briefly. The law, which is a basic law, we don't have a constitution, but we have a set of fundamental or basic laws that are meant to serve as the foundation for the whenever constitution that we are going to have, if we are going to have, but it's some sort of a sub-constitution for now. So it's a stronger law than regular laws. And the nation-state law basically reconfirms or asserts the character of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, as solely a Jewish state, as a state only for the Jewish nationality. There is nothing about this law that hasn't been implemented forever, basically, de facto on the ground. Of course, it starts with the recognition of Israel as solely the nation-state for the Jewish people. It includes articles like enhancing Jewish settlement, and I'm talking about inside the lines of 48, as a national project, which of course is something that has been done since the establishment of the state. It includes the downgrading of the Arabic language from a status of an official language in Israel into an unofficial one. But then Palestinian citizens in Israel had to go to the Supreme Court time and time again to have the state put street signs in Arabic or signs in the national airport, or having them actually producing official documents in the official Arabic language. So it's not that it's been really used. So in practice, again, there is very little new about that law. Which brings about the question, so why now? I mean, is really the Jewish identity of the state of Israel is under that much threat that it needs to be asserted by such a violent declarative law? We are speaking about a time that the right wing in Israel has been in power what seems to be forever. No threat to it whatsoever. I mean, it's nowhere in the horizon anything that can challenge the absolute power of right wing right now in Israel. No threat to the Hebrew language either, except for badly using it by Israeli Jews. But this is really the only threat to the Hebrew language right now. It's not that Arabic is somehow threatening the language. So why? Why all of a sudden this need to make that very arrogant and very blunt declarative act, the nation-state law? And I think that in a way it was almost inevitable as a second phase to the first phase of the physical war against the Palestinian citizens. So, and then after having done with that phase, it's time for the most symbolic layer of the eternal Zionist war against its Palestinian citizens. So if we're starting from, I don't want to go even earlier than that, but let's say starting from 1948 and the establishment of the state. Just by declaring the state to be Jewish and democratic, then of course the immediate meaning is demographic war against the Palestinian citizens, because if you want to have it both Jewish and democratic, you need to somehow make sure that a very solid Jewish majority is kept. So the first phase for the, let's say, first couple of decades was a physical war by expulsion, by land grab, by setting the foundations for a systematic, institutionalized discrimination on a very physical, immediate level. 1967 and the occupations that came with it were sort of a setback in the terms that if until 1967 that physical elimination was sort of normalized already, 67 brought back once again the physical aspect of this confrontation. It made Israel had to confront once again the physical, more tangible dimension of its position vis-à-vis the Palestinians. And this is still going on beyond the Green Line. Yeah? In the West Bank, we are still in the phase of the physical, in its most immediate meaning more. There is an ethnic cleansing going on in the West Bank, certainly in the Jordan Valley, the Bedouin populations in Area C, which is most of the occupied territories. So the physical war is going on there. But inside 48, it has been institutionalized already, and it's not really, that became the normal way of being. And so now it's time to embark upon the symbolic against the narrative, because narrative is a very powerful thing, and against identity, which is also a very powerful thing. And here, I think that layer of the symbolic and of the identity and cultural war provides there for a moment an opportunity for a very interesting encounter between the Palestinian citizens and the Mizrahi Jewish community in Israel as a secondary victim of that level of war. Because us, the Mizrahis, we were never a target in the first level. The war against us has always been on the symbolic, cultural, identity level. On the more tangible, physical level, we were, of course, part of the Zionist project just by our Jewish bodies. That was the purpose of bringing the Mizrahi communities, which are just because they are more Jewish bodies in the Jewish demographic war against the Palestinians. And we were brought to serve that purpose, and we did. But all the while, except for using our again, Jewish presence, Jewish being, as part of the tangible war, there was always an ongoing cultural identity war against the Mizrahi, because we were always seen as part of the jungle, to to which the Zionist villa in the jungle refers to. I mean, Zionism always likes to see it, to describe itself as a villa in the jungle, Israel. So us Mizrahis were always seen as the natives of the jungle. Of course, not in the same nativeness as the Palestinians, but if now the Arab culture, the Arabic language, the Arabic identity are under a more direct attack, then certainly it concerns us as well, the Mizrahis, because it's our language and our heritage and our culture. So you could think that for a moment there was a chance of actually, you know, joining forces or making a point about that together. We did actually. There was a group of us of about 60 Mizrahi activists, academists, intelligentsia, artists, and such. We petitioned to the High Court of Justice against the nation-state law from a Mizrahi perspective, claiming exactly that when you target, when you mark the Arab identity in the space as an inferior one by the nation-state law, then we are the secondary victims. It steps to target the Palestinian citizens, there's no doubt about that. But it also, we have stakes in it. I mean, we have a say about that. How much time do I have? Okay. So for me, I mean, and maybe we will get to speak about how these things are being expressed in the daily life. But as an Iranian born who is greatly proud of her heritage and culture, and you know, it's Iran. I know how it feels though living as an Iranian Jew in Israel. I mean, you're being looked at as an inferior one, and it concerns all of us Mizrahim. That's the daily experience of Mizrahim in Israel. So then you would think, well, so that makes a lot of sense. Why were you such a small group? And believe me, we are a very, 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 very small minority within the Mizrahi general population in Israel. And I think that, you know, in a way, the fact that we were so little participating in this petition, in a way for me it sums up the Mizrahi tragedy in Israel, that by and large we've been so much trapped into this sort of deal that Zionism offered the Mizrahim from the very beginning, that we don't really want you inside the villa. And there are, I can quote on and on from the protocols of the government before bringing in the Mizrahim. Believe me, these are horrible things that they said about us even before they saw us, before we actually arrived to Israel, that we are bringing in these barbarians, how they're going to affect our culture, etc. It's all well documented. But then we declared it to be Jewish state, and we need Jewish demography, so we bring you in. But you're still, we will never forget that you came from the jungle inside, and you will need to prove to us daily that you deserve this place, your place in the villa, even if it's like in the cellar. So you need to reject actively your Arab identity, you need to actively be more patriotic, you need to actively hate Arabs more than we do, so that we don't confuse you by mistake with those outside the walls. I think that there is another option. There is really, I think, for me, it's very clear that I'm in Tajamma, in Balad, again, a democratic national Palestinian party, not just out of solidarity with Palestinians, which I certainly have, but first and foremost as a Mizrahi Jew. Without a doubt, my project as a Mizrahi is to bring down the walls of this imaginary villa, to reconnect, and then the question of being native might be an option for me once again, to reconnect to the area as a native of the area, something that I certainly cannot do as long as I'm trapped in the colonial walls of this villa, and therefore it's very obvious to me that my liberation as a Mizrahi depends on the Palestinian national liberation. That's what I'm doing there. If it's around the corner, probably not. I think we have a long way to go, but I think we can at least put it on the table as a political option, because one day the walls will collapse. I have no doubt about that. So I'll stop at that.
So a lot to unpack there. Mindful that we only have an hour, so I'm going to try and be as efficient as possible. You spoke a little bit about how the notion of your acceptance being conditional or contingent on pledging loyalty to this Jewish supremacist state, to being molded that way, and even then your place is decided based on that and where you fit into this existing racial hierarchy. I'm really interested also to talk a little bit about, before we expand upon specifically your community and the role that activists have played. I want to go back to this notion of security and the interplay of the army and politics and Israeli society. So can you tell us a little bit about that, how security is made to be deeply embedded into the nation's psyche, how everything from education to your social life is hyper-militarized?
Yeah, it's funny, the Israeli media loves to show Palestinian kids in a Hamas march or whatever. I think there are very little militarized, deeply militarized societies like the Israeli ones, and it begins in a very, very early age. I'll tell you from my own experience, my first confrontation with my older daughter's kindergarten teacher. My daughter is now 20, she was 16 years ago, so she was about 4. So the first time I confronted, she was 4. She came home with a list of items, like snacks and different things, and it said that that's the list of items that she requires to bring the next day to make packages for soldiers. And I thought, well, that's very weird. She's way too young to be recruited to the defense forces. So I called the teacher and I said, why? She couldn't understand why I was so upset. She really, honestly, it wasn't even out of a political, aware stand. She just couldn't understand what was the problem with it. And I told her, look, everything aside, this is the richest, the wealthiest organization in the state. Half of our budget goes to the army. Do they really need little kids making packages for them? If you want to, teach them to be kind and empathetic, then I can find two dozen different exactly, that there are 2 different houses for elderly people in the neighborhood of the kindergarten. I mean, we can find stuff. Her answer was, it's a profoundly civilian act to do. And I said, well, fine. We didn't send her to kindergarten the next day, and the next year we just moved to the bilingual Arab Jewish school in Jerusalem. And then it goes on and on and on. In the youth organization, the Scouts, the Israeli Scouts. They form like little army units with the discipline and the same terminology and the same like rituals and everything. They go to training in the army. At 11th grade, they have every Jewish school in Israel, except for the ultra-Orthodox, bring in soldiers from different units to each try to make propaganda for his own unit to withdraw. And the schools compete. One of the criteria that our Ministry of Education applies is how many percentages of your graduates of the school going to combat units. It's not about academic excellence, it's about how many good soldiers you produce. And it goes on to, so it's extremely militarized.
Are job prospects affected by this?
Oh, first of all, there are there's a whole list of jobs that you cannot do if you didn't serve in the army. That is the requirement for not just things that actually have to do like security or stuff like that. If you want any governmental position, for example, then of course you have to. But it's not just a requirement, it provides the military service in Israel is a fantastic network, also in terms of jobs, especially in the computer, more sophisticated, more prestigious units. People really want to go to these places because after that you are set for life. Because you get the best equipment, the best knowledge, and you start with a huge advantage if you come out of one of these units. You make great contacts, and then you say they take you to sit in that board and that board. So it's a very efficient network.
Taking it a step back, how did you get to be where you are today? I mean, presumably you've bypassed some of these structural, institutionalized issues, or was there a turning point where you realized I'm complicit, and I need to be doing things differently? Was it a watershed moment, or were there a series of things that took place?
It wasn't one thing. I think that I had the huge privilege of immigrating to Israel when I was old enough to understand, even at a very intuitive level at first, but to understand what it means to be Iranian and to really have this identity very deep. You speak with, you look at second generation Mizrahim in Israel, it's very common that they already internalize their imposed inferiority, and there was, like, you speak with younger Mizrahis, what it is your biggest dream? It's to open a mechanic shop or something. They don't even dare to. So I wasn't a result of that. So I came, and that really helped me, because whenever I was confronted with this Israeli Ashkenazi look at me as inferior, I knew that I knew where I wasn't confused about that. So that helped me to look, to have a different perspective. I live in Jerusalem. You need to be actively blind not to see, reality in Jerusalem. I studied in Mount Scopus in the Hebrew University. Going up there every day, you see lines of Palestinians being held by policemen along the walls. You see that. When you're in Mount Scopus, you cannot not hear shootings from Isawiya, from the Palestinian village, which is less than 300 meters from the campus. So it was but the shift, I think, was a course about Mizrahi politics that all of a sudden just connected all the dots for me. You know, you go through the phases until I reached Balad, which gives, you know, the whole notion, the political agenda of Balad, a state for all its citizens. It just makes a lot of sense. And,
can you tell the people who don't know what that is?
Oh, sorry, we didn't ask the question.
I'm just asking her to explain a term.
We can't hear the question.
That's fine.
Sara just suggested very rightly that I will explain what Balad is and what is their political program, state of all its citizens, for all its citizens. So as I said, Balad Tajammo is the Palestinian Democratic National Alliance party. And what Balad is suggesting is actually really, really simple. Somehow in Israel they managed to label this as terrorist huggers, ultra-nationalists, really dangerous people. But what Balad is saying is very, very simple. Individual civilian rights equal to all. I mean, a full democracy, in other words, something that would be very natural in any normal democracy in the world. In Israel, it seems like very, very extremist. So the first part is a state for all its citizens, meaning full rights on the individual level. And but it's not. But a person doesn't live just as an individual. We live as national collectives as well. Even if we don't hold national identity as a value by itself, that identity dictates our place in the hierarchy, and therefore we are entitled to collective rights as well as the individual rights. And what Balad is saying is that a part of the equal civilian rights, both national entities, one, the indigenous Palestinian nationality inside 48, we are talking about now just inside 48, and in a very pragmatic look at reality, Balad says there is another national entity. We might not like it, or we won't certainly forget the price of the Nakba. But the truth is that for 70 years, another national identity emerged here, which is Jewish Israeli. And that one should be acknowledged as well. Now, it's Jewish Israeli, it's not Jewish. It means that it doesn't include all the Jews of the world, so no right of return, in other words. And yes, of course, the right of return to the Palestinian refugees. And the other one is that, as opposed to Zionism, it cannot be exclusive. I mean, just a very basic admission that there are two national identities in that space. And again, I'm talking only about 48. And that they both deserve self-determination. Always when I say it outside Israel, it doesn't sound that outrageous. In Israel, it's like completely explosive.
So many of us in the room would know that Australia is, of course, a fellow settler colonial project, and there are many conversations within the sort of the left movement, especially, they've been going on for a long time, but let's say they've been escalated following the election the last couple of months. And I think one of the very evident themes has been around the fact that we are trying to look for solutions and for answers within systems, and systems that were never designed to give us those solutions and answers. And I'm interested to hear about what, if any, what conversations are happening around this within some similar movements within 48, and what are these conversations, and how do people feel around, do we operate within the parameters of the state and the system within political parties, or do we need to take a step back and dismantle that? And is that a more long-term more long-term thing?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a huge conversation inside 48 Palestinian society, to the extent that in the past elections that we've had, not such long ago, one of the most vocal and prominent Palestinian voices was the one called to boycott the elections altogether. We have Palestinian voices that have been holding that position for a long time. Nail Balad, for example, that have been saying that for a long time, that now I'm speaking as the Palestinian voice, that we do not have anything to gain, and we actually have only something to lose, because just by participating in the so-called Israeli democracy, we are legitimizing it without being able to achieve even the simplest things. It's growing. It's becoming a more and more dominant voice. I think that the majority of the Palestinian citizens inside 48 are not quite there, although after the nation-state law, certainly whatever the remaining of trust they had in the margins of the Israeli democracy was lost. But then again, but there are two things to consider on the other side. One is that you still can use sometimes the privileges, the very limited privileges that this participation gives you, not to legitimize the system, but to actually fight it. I think the best example is the example of previously Parliament member Bassel Ghattas from Balad, that used the immunity that being a Parliament member gives him to actually smuggle in cellular phones to political Palestinian prisoners inside the Israeli jails. Of course, he was labeled immediately as assistance to terrorism, whatever. But I wrote about it that it's probably the most honorable use that any Knesset member ever had with his position. But these are very, and you pay a heavy price. He just was released recently after 2 years in prison. So there's a price to it. And the other thing is that boycotting, saying, take your so-called democracy and choke on it, we're just leaving. It's a valid position, but then it needs to be, it needs a well-planned strategic move. It cannot be just out of a whim. Then you need to build and strengthen a very united political front outside the Knesset, which unfortunately the Palestinian citizens don't have right now. Whatever leadership there is outside the Knesset is very partisanly biased and doesn't have the trust of the society. So there are certain steps that need to be done before it can be used as a strategic tool, and then I think it can be very, very effective.
You mentioned that your collective, your plural, your liberation is inextricably linked to that, of course, of Palestinians. Although I disclaim that by saying that, of course, those two groups don't have mirror origins and motivations. So there's very different roles to play there. But I really would love to hear internally about how Jews of conscience are organizing and mobilizing, and how you're quite frankly subverting your roles as inadvertent as it may be, as inadvertent settlers also. And not just within, but if those connections are being made beyond 1948, so to the occupied Palestinian territories.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you follow the situation back there, you see that the Jewish left is pretty much erased off the political map. There is really nothing. So we left, like, what's left is pockets of activism in different forms. There is, it's different. I'll start with West Bank because it's a little bit easier to talk about the situation there. There it's very simple. There, the purpose is end the occupation. So you have a very clear, defined objective, and you go to the Palestinian initiated protests and demonstrations, fully aware of the fact that, and they invite us, we have good connection with Palestinian activists, mostly in West Bank and of course East Jerusalem, that invite us, knowing that whenever there are Jewish Israelis, the soldiers are less likely to shoot, they are less likely to be that violent. They are violent and they do arrest, and we, you know, get the gas, the tear gas and everything, but they won't shoot live bullets when there are Jewish Israelis there. So we are, you know, that's the use that we can do with our privileges as Jews. Soldiers won't shoot us. They will shoot at Palestinians. If there are no Jewish activists, it's very probable that they will shoot. So this is our role in the West Bank. It's against the occupation, it's very concrete, we know what we come to do there. Inside 48 it's a lot more complicated because I think that even the most radical Jewish circles do not always fully understand the meaning of their set of privileges inside 48, that these privileges are just as valid inside as they are outside the green lines. And so inside 48 you will find people love to talk about coexistence, and people love to talk about mutual resistance and about, but then what happens many times is that immediately there is a Jewish dominance in these organizations, or and even if the activists are, the majority of the activists are Palestinian citizens, but the Jewish voice somehow manages to become the dominant. So it's a very difficult line to try to actually do something active with constantly being aware that you cannot, I mean, it should be led by Palestinians. For me it's very easy, I mean, Balad, I have no presumptions of leadership, I mean, it's Palestinian led, it's a Palestinian project. For really other activists with very good intentions, sometimes the implementation of these goodwills create a different set of political and ethical problems of their own. If that makes any sense, what I'm saying.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I don't know how many of you. So there is a newish organization standing together. In Israeli terms, they are far radical left. Yeah. It was initiated by Dov Hanin, who was a Jewish Knesset member until the last elections from the Hadash party, which is mainly the communist party. again, Hadash is a good example by itself because they always present themselves as a Jewish Arab party. Look at the voters of Hadash and you will see at least 85% Palestinian voters. And yet, these 10 to 15% of Jewish voters are enough to already create a false symmetry that is simply not there. And then the activist organization that they established recently, standing together on the Beyachad, is just a continuation of that. Because again, this false symmetry that they, because of good reasons, I don't doubt their intentions, you know, there's something very optimist about Jews and Arabs fighting together or existing together, but there is no symmetry in real life. And if we are not very actively aware of that, we are not fighting against Jewish domination and superiority, we are actually enhancing that.
So it's very easy to romanticize this, particularly if there's a savior mentality, without acknowledging or recognizing the asymmetry in power and privilege. Yes. And I suppose, you know, colonial projects, you know, are created to serve supremacist interests, as we've said, at the expense of brown and black bodies, at the expense of indigenous populations. For me, what is also really maybe hopeful at this point, or where there are pockets of hope, is an optimism, is these global connections, you know, between indigenous struggles for self-determination. And so there's been, I would say, maybe a growing recognition or a growing anti-colonial and specifically anti-Zionist movement globally.